So the authors of the Gospel are anonymous?
That is the clear scholarly consensus.
There's zero manuscript evidence for that claim.
Oh, Lord, he's going to argue for traditional authorship of the Gospels.
We don't have any anonymous copies. Every copy is always titled Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John.
Here's the deal. His claim that there's no manuscript evidence that the Gospels are anonymous is technically true and completely irrelevant. The early manuscripts that we have with titles do attribute those to the traditional authors. But those manuscripts don't appear until 200 or later, at the point which traditional authorship had been ascribed. There's no manuscript evidence from before that with titles, so technically there's no manuscript evidence for any position. And the traditional titles were certainly not original to the works. Authors would not have written the gospel according to me at the top of their gospel. You would only get labels differentiating different gospels once multiple gospels were in circulation, and the ascription of those authors would not have been made by the authors themselves, but by other people.
There's actually no solid evidence that the Bible was even written by eyewitnesses or disciples.
Yeah, and you're wrong. Manuscript tradition, the internal clues, and the early and weighty testimony is very solid evidence.
Is evidence, it's not very good evidence. You do get some early ascriptions by figures like Papias, who talks about a Gospel of Mark and a Gospel of Matthew, but in the only case that we're actually sure of, the Gospel of Matthew, he's clearly not talking about the Gospel of Matthew that we have. He says that the Gospel of Matthew is a collection of logia, of statements in Hebrew, none of which fits with the Gospel of Matthew that is in the Bible. Apostolic fathers like Polycarp and Ignatius quote from Gospels, but don't attribute them to anyone. The first time that we get citations together with attribution is in the work of Justin Martyr. There we're talking about Matthew, Mark, and Luke, not John, and by then you're in the middle of the 2nd century.
When was the Bible written? Well, the Gospels were written decades after Jesus.
Right, still within the lifetime of the disciples. There was strong oral tradition, and you don't forget events like that.
They were likely written within the lifetime of some disciples. There is not good evidence to suggest that they were written by disciples or by eyewitnesses. And there's a fair amount of evidence internal to the Gospels that they were not written by eyewitnesses. The Gospels of Luke and John both make clear that they collected stories from people that they believed to be eyewitnesses, which suggests that they are not eyewitnesses. The author of the Gospel of Mark does not know local Palestinian geography. And the author of the Gospel of Matthew just lifts the story where Jesus meets Matthew from the Gospel of Mark would be a weird thing to do if it was a story about yourself. Since these are not by eyewitnesses, the question of memory is really beside the point.
So what language was the Gospels first written in? Greek. Did the disciples speak Greek? Did Jesus speak Greek? No, they didn't.
Prove it.
Proof really isn't a standard for such arguments. This is a much debated question, but there are good reasons to think that Jesus and the disciples did not speak Greek. Mark Chancey, for instance, has argued on the basis of archaeological and manuscript evidence that the area of the Galilee was largely insulated linguistically. And even if Jesus and the disciples did know some Greek, it is remarkably unlikely that they were literate in the language.
Anyways, we do have good reason to believe that Jesus and the disciples knew Greek. It was the common language of the time, and the background and professions of the gospel authors makes it even more likely that they knew it.
As noted, Greek was not the common language of the Galilee. Most of the disciples appear to have been lower-class laborers or fishermen, not the type of people that would necessarily have known Greek. The idea that Matthew, one of the disciples, was a tax collector is a contested historical fact, and you can't argue from that to the reliability of the Gospels, given that the question is about the reliability of the Gospels. And in any case, as noted previously, there's no good reason to think that the disciples wrote the Gospels. The linguistic break between the disciples and the Gospel authors, the internal evidence from the Gospels themselves, and the lateness of citation with attribution are all reasons that have convinced the majority of scholars that the Gospels are, in fact, anonymous. Jesus is disappointed. Do better.